Okay, it's 2:15, so I will officially kick us off and introduce Paul, who's going to talk about automating inclusive documentation.
Thanks, Jen. And thank you, everyone, for sacrificing some time of your weekend. I know you need that probably to unwind from the stress of the previous week, but thank you for joining me. I just want to thank the volunteers and the organizers for doing such a great job with Nerd Summit this year in pivoting from a physical location and event into this digital event that we have now. Yeah, I'm Paul Grenier, the front-end developer and JavaScript developer. Been doing this for over 10 years now. About halfway through my journey, I learned about accessibility, and now I'm pushing more of non-code solutions for some of the problems that I see in organizations. And I work at Slalom, which is a great organization. You can ask me questions about them later. But this is an opportunity, I think, for most organizations. So yeah, there's a link here if you want to follow along in the slide deck on your own, bit.ly/i7e docs, and we'll get started. So the first thing I'll say is that, and this is a big idea, when you're acting inclusive, you're not gatekeeping. You're doing the opposite of gatekeeping. But if you're not being inclusive, then you actually are gatekeeping. So gatekeeping's it's maybe a loaded term or a jargon term, but in developer community, gatekeepers are those that are putting up barriers for others to join. And if you were at the keynote, then you know we want to remove those barriers. We want more people to become part of the conversation and tech so that we have better solutions. So my assumption about you, you work with code, or maybe you work with people who code. You believe in putting people first, and this means for your organization and also for your products and services. This might hit with some people who are designers, so like human-centered design, but I'm going to talk about inclusive design here and inclusivity. Inclusive design principles is something you can look up. I've left a link in the slide deck. If you're not familiar with inclusive design principles, it's a great place to start. So to be effective, we need people who have a process. That process is probably going to evolve over time as people learn from doing the process and learn from each other. To be effective, we need to be creating tools that help us iterate faster, produce faster, and that's one of the things that some people who put tools too far ahead in the solutioning situation, they might be going very fast in the wrong direction. So we want our people to figure out the right process, and then from that process, we build tools. It is a very cyclical thing, and I'll get into that. So let's first talk about people. I love this quote from Martin Fowler, and the quote is, "Any fool can write code that a computer can understand. Good programmers write code that humans can understand." And that was a big aha moment for me as a younger programmer. I was obsessed with being clever and writing shorter and shorter code, something we call code golfing. That doesn't help other people learn. It doesn't help explain your ideas. And it actually does a disservice even to your future self. When you have to go back and look at code you wrote, you do that head scratch moment and not really sure why you wrote something that way. So we call it idiomatic code, so self-evident code or self-documenting code. But really it's about writing code that is inclusive, that allows more people to understand what's going on. There's a cartoon that's shared across the web about this, where bad code and good code, where code can be measured in WTFs per minute. So good code has fewer WTFs per minute. Bad code has a lot of WTFs per minute. And that is something that, as a general quality measurement, it's sort of amorphous or hard to grasp. Maybe a WTF moment for one person might be very readily apparent to another developer. So it's important when considering what might trip someone up to also think about different perspectives. So one of the things that's been evident over the years is that with all the research product owners and organizations have put into what is separating good code from bad code, they've found some principles to adhere to. And these are simple, focused, structured, consistent, meaningful, and conventional. All of these things lend to making code easier to understand. Something that another developer will be able to read through and understand sooner, faster, more completely. And that's only going to help them in their journey to maybe adding a feature, fixing a bug, or supporting a customer. So what's interesting though is we've also put a lot of effort into tools and process. So the process for this is, and this is another web cartoon, it's the last one, I promise. So this is from XKCD. It's very popular among programmers. In this one, there's a developer asking another developer for a code review. And the first programmer says, keep in mind, I'm self-taught, so my code may be a little messy. The other programmer says, let me see, I'm sure it's fine. Then after reviewing for a little bit, wow, this is like being in a house built by a child using nothing but a hatchet and a picture of a house. Next frame, it's like a salad recipe written by a corporate lawyer using a phone autocorrect that only knew Excel formulas. And then next frame, it's like someone took a transcript of a couple arguing at IKEA and made random edits until it compiled without errors. And then the first programmer replies, okay, I'll read a style guide. So style guides are the process. It's the document that we use to drive all code efforts. Teams that have a style guide, they are more likely to move through code reviews a little bit faster with fewer arguments because they're not going to sweat the small stuff. Syntax and grammar has been hammered out and a decision has been made and the team is all adhering to it. So this helps teams get to the other aspects, the other things like simple and well-structured that they have to review in a code review. And documentation is, because it's a tool, and if we treat it like code, we can put it into the same development cycle that we use for code. And the sort of meta thing about this, which is hard to explain and hard to diagram, is that documentation happens so frequently, we don't even notice it. And I don't have the chat up, but this is an opportunity here. If anyone can think of documentation that works inside the DevOps cycle, go ahead and put it in the chat and maybe Jen could read some of them. Wait just a couple of seconds. Anything?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, so in the plan phase, there's probably going to be some like an SOW, right? If you're working with a customer, statement of work. There could be requirements, right? And during create, the designer might create some documentation describing a feature or a user story. Then during the verification process, there's going to be documentation created about, well, did it pass? Like QA might be writing this. So there's a back and forth now between development and QA. The packaging process, how we move code from one phase of development into another, and then ultimately how we release it, those need documents. Because we want to make sure that if someone is out and we need to do a package or a release, that someone else can follow the same process. Configuration, once we turn it over maybe to the customer or to an end user who's going to configure that software, that needs documentation. It's for a different audience, but it's very important. And we're going to monitor how our software performs in the wild and maybe issues that get created. So all of these things create documentation. There's a lot of opportunities for that documentation to be inclusive. If we treat the documentation like code, and this is the only, I've only made a small change to this diagram from the previous one. So I added, it's DevDocOps instead of DevOps. And instead of starting with planning, we're going to start with change. So anytime our processes change, that's an opportunity to go through this cycle and create an evolution of our DevDocs or our documentation. And again, our documentation can come in a lot of forms. And the more we can add process and tooling to this, the more likely we are to be both efficient and effective at generating that documentation. So DevDocOps, and this is, again, completely made up word, but I took, there's a few other design ops, and there's a few other takes on this, but just inserting a word in there doesn't make it real, but we'll say it is for now. So DevDocOps is continuous improvement for all of our processes. It's the process we need to follow for each of our processes. Again, this is very meta and it might be hard to wrap your head around it, but we'll have hopefully plenty of time for Q&A. So this is, again, a big idea slide. So take a minute to soak that in. Continuous improvement. It's something we talk about with code, but we don't always talk about it with our processes, or especially with our documentation, which should be documenting our processes. So if we can practice continuous integration, continuous improvement of those processes, then our organization is going to be evolving a lot faster than if we're just concentrating on the code. I like this quote from Michael Jackson. He's a developer for React and very heavily involved in React training. React is a framework for front-end developers, very popular, built by Facebook, but has since sort of transcended Facebook. The quote is, no joke, about 95% of the work in open source is around education. Docs, issues, pull requests, reviews, websites, blog posts, talks, tweets, examples, etc. Writing the code is the easy part. Helping people use it is the vast majority of your responsibility as an OSS dev. In this case, OSS is open source software. So one of the things we know from a lot of other research into how people read, how people process large bodies of text, and this goes back decades, this research, is that there are similar concepts to what makes prose more understandable. Using an inverted pyramid structure in the organization, so start with the big idea up top and then winnow it down to the details. Useful headings, plain language. Plain language is thought of as something that's simple to understand for someone who is maybe the 8th, 9th grade reading level. And there are lots of definitions of that and lots of different algorithms to, and we'll touch on some of those for measuring it. Being consistent and concise and using lists often. So this is another example of using a list. Help people process information. And being understandable is inclusive, right? So if we have people who are coming to a project or a process for the first time, they're having maybe a hard time understanding something in that process, or why something's being done, or how it's being done, chances are it's the documentation's fault. It's not their fault. This could have been handled better earlier on by the team, by the organization. So again, we have a lot of opportunities in our documentation to apply rigor and structure to make sure that it's understandable and it includes our new hires, maybe our non-coders, junior coders, customers, right? Because if customers can be part of the solution, they're more invested in our product and projects. It's very important, especially in open source. There's for anyone who's really in the numbers game, maybe if you're on the project management side or team leader side, some measurements done by Nielsen Group said that there could be up to 124% task improvement when simple language is used. And That's a huge improvement. This is a time-based task. So this is a task, maybe it takes an hour, and maybe now it takes less than 30 minutes because of this 124% improvement. So if you assume the 80-20 rule for a developer, that this developer on task, 80% of the time they have, they're typing code, they're actually coding. And 20% of the time they're reading, maybe it's reading someone else's documentation, reading API documentation, reading internal team documentation, maybe it's just requirements or reports of issues. In that sense, and I think that's the most aggressive. Like I think it's somewhere between the 80-20 and the 5-95, but assuming the 80-20, you could save 200 hours per year per developer by improving your documentation. So that means that you should be able to spend, one developer should be able to spend 5 weeks on improving documentation before, and even on a small team, before it starts to impact the team's speed. The team, if you're spending maybe a month just on documentation, the entire team is going to be moving that much faster after the documentation improves. So if you go with Michael Jackson's scenario, where he spends what he considers 95% of his time not coding, but working on documentation, then this is 1,000 hours per year per developer. If there are more people on his team that are like that, then that's 6 months of just improving documentation to lift and speed up the team. That's quite a lot of effort. And I would almost guarantee there's no one on the call here working with coders or working in teams that are spending that amount of time on documentation and process documentation automation. Huge opportunity. So let's talk about some tools. I didn't get a chance to survey the group, but if you are a developer, then this is probably where you wanted to be anyway. So I'll talk about first for code. So for code, we have tools, we call them linters and formatters. Formatters, they shape our code into a conventional format that makes it a little bit easier to process, understand. Nobody gets tripped up on certain grammatical and syntactical choices in that code because it's conventional. Linters help us remove or avoid bad choices that are either going to decrease understanding or potentially cause errors or bugs. So think of linters as removing bad things, formatters as just reshaping what you put there. That's really the limit of it. And there's a lot of power in that, but we still have to do code reviews to handle what is this module or is this code being focused, structured, meaningful, and consistent. All of that needs a little more effort. If you were to do automation around that, it would have to be customized. And I would say that certain things like focused and structured may still not even be possible, at least on the front end. There's a lot of different technologies, a lot of different techniques, and we spend a lot of time doing code reviews that could be better spent if we had better tools. The interesting thing is that for pros, you would think that this would be harder to solve because when people speak and people write, they can go much farther than what you would expect to be maybe the boundaries of a programming language. But interestingly enough, the ideas of plain language, consistency, being concise, using lists, we already have tools that do that. And people have solved for this already. It's only what we would need in an editorial review to review structure and useful headings. Those are the things that actually they don't take very long to review. So if we can apply some tooling, some automation to satisfy the left side, the plain language, consistent, concise, and lists, then we're going to probably spend remarkably less time reviewing documentation before it publishes and a lot less time reading that documentation because that documentation is very readable. So this is a flow I came up with. This is a novel concept, but it's an amalgam of all the tools I've found that try to do this. And by this, I mean process prose in some format and give you some metrics to follow or some feedback about the state of that prose. And this could be something simple like a spell check, or something more complicated like checking for inclusive language. Now, the way I've structured this is from left to right. You have to choose whether or not you're going to be using the command line interface or an application interface, so API or CLI. Next, you'll have to choose whether or not you're using a zero config solution, something that's pre-configured, or a BYOC, bring your own config. Then there's this gray box in the middle, and this is where a lot of the magic happens with the systems and tools that we have, and I'll review a few of those so we can talk about them. Some of them we're going to be inputting the data, so that's the first step here. It's going to be using probably HTTPS, hopefully not HTTP, not secure, files, or standard in, so from the command line. So at somehow your document is going to be inserted into this process in one of those ways. Then there's a formatting decision that has to happen. Something has to decide, well, is this going to be used as HTML, Markdown, a text file, ASCII doc? There's a bunch of other formats, and sometimes the tool defines the format for you. So you may pick a tool for your process or for your organization. Maybe you already have a tool, and it specifies you have to write your documentation in Markdown. The one interesting option here is the unified JS ecosystem. That processes everything into an AST, an abstract syntax tree. And the cool thing about that is that's exactly how all of our linters and formatters for coding work. They work off of an abstract syntax tree. So if we can do an AST for prose, there's a lot of power in that. Once you've got your document into the docs flow, I'm calling it the docs flow, then there may have to be transformations. So you may have to go from HTML to Markdown, or from Markdown to text, or from HTML to text, to process that and to run some arbitrary code on it, something that's doing an evaluation, a count, some sort of metric that you're going to follow. And then I want to call out two specific tools here, and one is only going to work against HTML, and that's the Axe Core rule set. We can use Axe Core processing HTML to check the accessibility of that HTML. So this will make sure that we followed good HTML rules for that markup. And this is something that a lot of people, I think, forget to do with their documentation, because if they've spent some time tooling or automating in the process, their documentation is using templates, and it's being churned out on every code change, and it's being versioned along with the code, and maybe it's being shipped with a repository or a library or a project. But it's possible that there are accessibility bugs in the templates. There could be editorial errors or authoring errors that cause things like headings to be wrong. And Axe Core can find a lot of those for us. So it's a really good step. Everybody should do that. And with Axe Core, it's open source, and it works in a number of different testing frameworks. So there's an Axe checker for Jest, for Cypress, for Karma, just about anything you could think of. The last step is one that you may not have heard of, and I'm really enamored with this project. I want to use it everywhere now, and it's called Betterer. The Betterer project is all about making your code base better over time. So you start with metrics or tests, and the idea is that you set yourself goals and that you don't backslide. So every check-in, you want to either be at the same level you were or better. And it gradually tightens using something called snapshot testing. So snapshot testing, popularized by the Jest framework, it is the idea that you'll take a snapshot of the state of your code or your application or some test, and then at another run of that same test, you will check the snapshot comparison, and you'll see if anything changed. This is used a lot of times in things like visual regression testing or residual testing, where you want to make sure that more than what you intended did not change with your the change in the system. What Better can do is, and I'll show you examples later if we have time, is that you can set something like, I want to make sure all the articles in our system have a read time under 5 minutes. And if you measure and you find that 5 out of 10 articles go over 5 minutes, then you add a new article. If let's say it's percentage based, you want to make sure that you didn't go above 50% that didn't meet that threshold, or you had a count of how many did not go above that threshold. So it's really wide open to how you want to structure it. So it's up to everyone to sort of understand their project and their processes and what metric, KPIs, OKR, whatever they want to follow, and then how they want to organize the automation around. So this is a good tool just to get you started. Something that I use a lot in my own writing is Readability Checker. It's something that Hayden Pickering wrote probably over a weekend. It's not a lot of code. It's all in JavaScript. It's open source in GitHub. You can read through it. I left a link in the slides. And it doesn't use any outside libraries either. He follows the Wikipedia definition for one of the many algorithms to check readability. I think he uses Fleischmann, maybe. I'll have to double check. But it works with using JSDOM, which can take a document or it can take a URL, and it'll load that URL. It'll parse the HTML, and it will provide a readability score by only looking at what's in the p tag or the paragraph tags. So if you're looking at a page that doesn't have any p tags, it's not going to be able to tell you much. But this is really good for articles, blogs, documentation pages. So I use it a lot. And I've used the same structure from the previous flow diagram so that you can understand a little bit of how this works. Works off the command line interface, and there's no config needed, although I think you can edit his code if you feel confident. It works off of HTTP, so it predicts that you're going to use a URL, takes the information as HTML, and then processes it down to text under the hood, and then gives you a readability score. So very cool tool. And it's important that I think in this one, you want to get a high score. Higher is, and it'll tell you that when you're approaching, easy to read by most people, difficult to read, and it'll call out things like long words. Joblint is another one, and this is good for organizations because Joblint is an example. It's a little more complicated, and it has a rules file, and you can add your own rules. So if there are certain things you want to keep out of your job postings, you can take this project, clone it, and make modifications to it, and run your own Joblint. Again, works off of the CLI, the command line interface. You can use it no config, or you can bring your own config, either one. And it normally takes a file, so you'd be pointing it at a job posting text file to get back a list of things about jobs that there are things that it checks for, like hollow promises. Hollow promise example would be like competitive ping pong matches in the middle of the day. That's not something that is really a job perk. That's someone trying to entice a certain type of person to apply for the job. And it's probably better left out of the job posting, to be honest. If you wanted to use this at the command line against an already existing job posting that's maybe it's on a web page, then you can use curl, and you can pipe curl through another tool called Cheerio CLI. And Cheerio allows you to use a jQuery syntax when it's in the API form, a jQuery syntax to parse or manipulate the HTML. It's treated as text though. The Cheerio CLI, you can do the same sort of thing, but we only need to look at p tags if we follow Hayden's approach, and then output that as text. So I can take curl from URL, take the output of curl, run it through Cheerio CLI, and then pipe that to Joblint on the command line. And that'll do the same thing as if I was using it against a text file example. This is really cool if you get if you're inundated with recruiters asking you to look at certain jobs, you can take the URL for that job, run it through Joblint, and just see if you should even bother or not. Good stuff. Unified JS, I mentioned before, it's a much more powerful ecosystem. There are some tools that have been built entirely on the unified system of plugins. Alex is a great one. I think I left a link in the slide deck. GetAlex is a linter for inclusive language. So it actually will check your writing to make sure that things, that what you're writing is not sexist. It doesn't disparage against people with disabilities or ethnicities. It's got a lot going for it. And really more people should know about it, should be using it. But there may be certain terms that you can't not use. And there's, you know, it's, you know that that warning is not appropriate for your product or project. So you might have to do some modification to the configuration. It's not difficult if you know your way around JSON or YAML files, but everything's in JavaScript. So if you know JavaScript, you should be able to follow along. I've also used Unified to make my own plugins for things. You can have custom dictionaries, you can change the language. It's a very, very powerful system. And usually it works on either HTML, Markdown, or text. But there are converters that allow you to go through everything because everything is part of this AST. The really cool thing about Unified is there are a ton of plugins already. Most of them have been written by a developer named Titus, and Titus has, he's sort of a, I don't know, he's one of my heroes for parsing language. He's done a lot of great work and a lot of useful things that I've baked into other applications I've done to double check my work, to help me edit other people's work, and to be productive. So I really hope that you get to a point where you are encouraged to look at Unified. Veil can do a lot of the similar things. From the user's perspective, it's simpler. It's written in Ruby, so that's why I put the Ruby gem here. Veil is different in that it's taking the zero config approach, and there is a something called Veil Server, which is the only paid for product that I've talked about today. But Veil itself is open source. You can write your own Veil guides. I think that would be all in, if I remember correctly, I think that's all in YAML. But out of the box, there are some guides that have already been converted to Veil style guides, and they're very well-known ones: the Google documentation style guide and the Microsoft style guide. There are a few others, but I would say those are ones that developers probably want to look at, because a lot of times we want to emulate the big five, and maybe not in every way, but in their documentation, they've spent a lot of time on it. They have professional documentarians and tech writers. A lot of our teams don't benefit from that. So when they come up with a style guide and someone has automated the style guide for us in something like Veil, it's definitely a tool that you can use right away and start improving your writing. I will say some of these tools, when you are working with a project already in place, they're going to hurt your feelings. It's going to raise a lot of warnings on a lot of text, and it's going to take a while to get through it. And that's why I say try to use Betterer to just gradually improve over time. Every time you touch a file, leave it better than it was before. In the guise of simple language, a lot of times removing content is the first step, right? We tend to write more than we need to, and our point gets lost. So it's important sometimes to simplify things, and something like Veil, something like even external applications like the Hemingway app or Grammarly will encourage us to just delete.
Hey, Paul?
Yeah.
I'm just going to give you a friendly 10-minute warning.
Yeah, I'm on pace. We're good.
Okay.
I'll have a few minutes for questions too, which is great. Axe Core I mentioned. I mentioned I work now at Slalom, but I did for a couple of years work at DQ, the makers of Axe and Axe Core. It's a terrific rules engine. One of the best things about X, the methodology behind it, is that they pride themselves on no false positives. So unlike other linters and formatters and checkers and verifiers and validators, Xcore is not going to leave you, running through paces trying to figure out why something was raised as an issue. If it's raised as an issue by Axe, chances are almost all the time it's wrong. Axe is right. Axe is right. You're wrong. So by fixing your templates, you will reduce barriers for someone using assistive technology, or you'll reduce cognitive load on someone who's trying to follow your documentation, and that makes it more inclusive. And then lastly, here's the link to Betterer. It can be you can use it for code. I think that was what it was intended for, but I've chosen to write some basic thing. I left a link in the slides to a gist, which shows you how you can use word count to gauge reading time, and how you could check the reading score for a, I think I used it against my own article. Yeah, against HTML. So in passing, in summation, I would say you need style guide, but you need to automate your style guide to really give your team the lift and improve your processes at scale. Style guides are great, but a lot of times the more time you have it without spending time on automation, the less people are adhering to it because they're not being reminded of it on a regular basis. The joke of using something like a linter for code is that after a little while of using that linter, even if it was very opinionated and you didn't agree at the beginning, after a few months of writing code in that style, when the linter's not on, you know it. You can look at your own code and you know that it's wrong. You don't even have to really be processing all the rules. You've internalized them. And we need our teams to get to that level for their own writing. So we need them to be using, even if it's just using the readability checker on a regular basis, or as part of a check-in, they're going to start to internalize that, and they're going to be writing better. And their better writing is going to lead to hopefully more conversions, sales, and happier customers. And now I would say I'm done. So if anyone has questions or comments, I'm going to go to where I can see the chat. And I can't figure, oh, there it is.
So
Hey, Gleb, thanks. Oh, and I forgot to give a shout out to Gleb. So Gleb gave a talk earlier about GitHub Actions, and there are some GitHub Actions for some of the tools I mentioned. So you could check those out, but it's also a great opportunity to merge those two technologies, and you can write GitHub Actions for these types of things. Let's see, linters, are there any for syntax like JavaScript? Absolutely. ESLint, TSLint, I think everything is more along the lines of merging towards that. We also, there's a very common formatter called Prettier, and there are plugins now for your popular IDEs. So any of your developers that are using, VS Code, for instance, is what I use. When we start a project, there's usually an agreement ahead of time. Okay, we're going to use standard, and we're going to use Prettier, or we're going to use ESLint, and we're going to use this. So we're going to pick a linter, and we're going to pick a formatter. And that way, when we get time to do code reviews, we don't argue about whether or not it's supposed to have semicolons. It's already handled. What are the stumbling blocks that you've seen when teams try to adopt these principles? One of them is one of the ones I was calling out, which is how much time can you spend on this before a product owner, product manager, or team lead starts getting a little antsy about, well, how much time are you taking doing this? It's not really contributing to the end product. It's not shipping our code faster. It's hard to measure at first, but it actually does improve the speed of the team. And it definitely, especially if your teams change over time, if they grow, they shrink, they change players, it's really important for onboarding. I couldn't stress that more. Having good, clear documentation, especially searchable documentation, can save people hours or days of doing research in the wrong direction. Any other questions or comments? Or it's the first time I've given this talk, so if you have any suggestions or feedback, feel free to give them to me here, or you can give it to me. I'm Autosponge on Twitter and GitHub, and pgrenier@gmail for email. I'm hoping to keep evolving this talk and improve it so that I can give it at my organization and maybe others, and make the community a little more inclusive, reduce barriers for new developers, non-coders to participate in what we do. I'll hang out for a few more minutes, but I don't see any other questions. So you're free to go. Thank you so much for spending the time. You'll have a few minutes to get to the next presentation.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. I do